Marcel Petiot had been born in 1897 in Auxerre, in central France. Long before the war made him notorious, there had already been signs that something was profoundly wrong with him. As a boy and teenager, he was intelligent but deeply unstable, prone to bizarre behavior, theft, lying, and outbursts that made teachers and relatives uneasy. He served in the First World War and later studied medicine, earning the title of doctor despite a life that remained chaotic and suspicious. Over the years, he practiced medicine, entered local politics, and repeatedly attracted allegations of theft, fraud, illegal narcotics dealings, and unexplained disappearances around him. Yet, again and again, he slipped through the cracks. He was charming when he needed to be, manipulative by instinct, and skilled at presenting himself as a respectable professional, even when evidence suggested he was anything but. By the time France fell to Germany in 1940, Petiot had settled into occupied Paris, where the war gave him what he had always needed most: confusion, fear, and a city full of vulnerable people. Under Nazi rule, countless Jews and others targeted by the Germans were searching desperately for ways to flee. To get out of occupied France was difficult, dangerous, and expensive. Many people sold homes, jewelry, family heirlooms, and businesses to buy forged papers and passage through underground escape routes that might or might not be real. In a city where people vanished every day, a false promise of salvation could be more believable than any warning. Petiot understood this perfectly. At some point during the occupation, he created a fake escape network. Using the alias Dr. Eugène, he spread word that he had special connections with the resistance and the criminal underworld and could move people safely out of France, through Portugal, and onward to South America. To desperate people, this sounded plausible. Portugal remained neutral, and South America was often imagined as the end point of escape. His price was high, which actually made the story more convincing. A real route out of Europe would be expensive. If someone was charging a fortune, perhaps it meant he truly had access to forged documents, border contacts, transport, and silence. His victims came to him through whisper networks, recommendations, and rumor. Many were Jews trying to escape deportation. Others were people hunted for political reasons, or individuals involved in black market dealings who needed to disappear. Petiot would tell them that for safety, they had to come quietly, bring their valuables, and cut off normal contact with friends and relatives. He instructed them not to tell anyone where they were going. That, too, made sense in occupied Paris. Secrecy was survival. Some came alone, others came as families. He received many of them at a townhouse at 21 Rue Le Sueur, in a respectable part of Paris's 16th arrondissement. From the outside, the house did not announce itself as a slaughterhouse. It looked like the residence of a well-off doctor, discreet and private. That normality was part of its power. People arrived expecting the final nervous stage before freedom. Instead, they were stepping into a carefully prepared death trap. Petiot told his victims that before leaving France, they needed an injection. He explained that South America required certain inoculations, or that the route involved special medical precautions. The details varied, but the authority of a doctor in a white coat was often enough. Many of the people who came to him had already been living for months or years in fear. They were exhausted, anxious, and eager to believe that the worst was almost over. Petiot would administer what he claimed was medicine. In reality, it was poison. Once his victims were dead or dying, he stripped them of money, jewelry, gold, and anything else of value. Then came the problem of the bodies. This was wartime Paris, a city where concealment mattered. Petiot experimented with multiple ways of disposal. He used quicklime, a caustic substance that can accelerate decomposition under certain conditions. He burned remains in stoves and furnaces. He dismembered bodies. He moved them between rooms, cellars, and hidden spaces inside the house. The methods were messy, improvised, and grotesque, but the chaos of the occupation helped shield him. Missing people did not automatically trigger immediate investigation. A vanished Jew might be assumed to have fled, been arrested, been denounced, or been killed in one of countless unnamed ways. To understand how long he was able to continue, it helps to understand the moral fog of occupied Paris. People distrusted the police, feared the Gestapo, and often knew only fragments of one another's lives. False identities were common. Real escape networks existed alongside fake ones. Bodies appeared in the city for political reasons, criminal reasons, and reasons no one ever learned. In that landscape, Petiot's crimes were almost hidden in plain sight. He did not need perfect secrecy. He only needed enough confusion to delay the truth. And there were warning signs. Neighbors noticed odd smells from Rue Le Sueur. They saw smoke. Some thought the doctor was using strange chemicals. Others suspected wartime business of one kind or another. But the occupation had accustomed Parisians to minding their own business. One learned not to look too closely at what happened behind closed doors, especially in a city where curiosity could be fatal. Petiot relied on this silence. He also cultivated a chaotic personal image that made him difficult to pin down. Depending on the situation, he could appear as a respectable physician, a resistant sympathizer, a patriot, a cynic, or a madman. He had enough intelligence to improvise explanations whenever needed. When authorities investigated him at various moments before his downfall, he often escaped by talking fast, changing direction, or exploiting rivalries between French police, German authorities, and underground groups. At one point, the Gestapo arrested him, suspecting him of anti-German activities, but he survived that as well. In a city where real resistance fighters, criminals, and opportunists often overlapped, Petiot could hide inside the confusion. For his victims, however, the deception ended at the door of Rue Le Sueur. One by one, they disappeared. The pattern became visible only in retrospect. People who had sold everything for an escape. People who left without a trace. People whose valuables were never seen again. Families waited for letters from Portugal or South America that never came. Friends reassured themselves that silence must mean the fugitives had made it safely out. In many cases, that hope probably lasted for months. Hope, in a way, became Petiot's accomplice. By March 1944, the volume of death hidden inside the house had become too much even for him to manage. On March 11th, neighbors complained to police about thick smoke and a foul, sickening smell coming from the chimney at 21 Rue Le Sueur. Concerned about a possible fire, police and firefighters entered the property. What they found was one of the most horrifying crime scenes in modern French history. In the basement, a coal stove was blazing. Around it and inside it were human remains. As authorities searched further, they found body parts in various stages of destruction and concealment. There were remains hidden in quicklime pits, remains partly burned, remains dismembered. The scene was not just one murder, but evidence of repeated murder on a scale almost beyond comprehension. The smell that had drifted into the street was the smell of a house overwhelmed by death. Petiot was not there when the police arrived. Almost immediately, newspapers seized on the story. Wartime Paris, numbed by years of occupation, suddenly had a fresh horror to contemplate. A doctor, perhaps a butcher, perhaps a madman, operating in the heart of the city. The public did not yet know the full story, but the details that emerged were lurid enough to grip the imagination. Here was a house with hidden rooms, smoke pouring from the chimney, quicklime, bones, and a doctor with a shadowy wartime identity. It sounded like a grotesque Gothic invention, but it was real. From the moment the remains were discovered, Petiot became one of the most wanted men in France. Yet, even then, he managed to survive in the shadows for months. He changed identities, moved through Paris under false papers, and tried to fold himself into the resistance. In one of the strangest twists of the case, he even wrote letters to newspapers and authorities attempting to shape the story in his own favor. He claimed that the bodies found in Rue Le Sueur were not victims he had murdered for profit, but enemies of France. Traitors, collaborators, and Germans killed by his secret resistance network. It was a monstrous, cynical defense, but in wartime France it was not entirely impossible on its face. Occupation had made the unbelievable seem routine. Still, the physical evidence in the house told another story. Investigators concluded that this was not the work of a patriotic underground execution squad, but a murder business. The valuables were missing. The victims had arrived expecting escape, not interrogation or punishment. The disposal method showed improvisation and concealment, not organized political violence. Petiot had not been cleansing France of its enemies. He had been preying on people whom the occupation had already placed in mortal danger. He remained at large until October 31st, 1944, after the liberation of Paris. By then, the Germans were gone, but the moral wreckage of the occupation remained. Petiot was finally recognized in the Paris metro and arrested. When police searched him, they found cash, false identity papers, and a handgun. He was no longer protected by occupation chaos, but he had lost none of his arrogance. During interrogations, he continued to lie, contradict himself, posture, and perform. He insisted that he was a patriot. He minimized the number of people he had killed. He claimed that whatever happened in the house had happened in the service of France. The investigation that followed was painstaking and imperfect. The condition of the remains made exact identification difficult. Many of the victims had been deliberately disfigured, dismembered, or reduced to fragments. The war itself had destroyed records, scattered families, and made ordinary accounting of lives much harder. Investigators ultimately tied Petiot to a number of murders that could be proven, but the real total has never been known with certainty. He was convicted in connection with 26 murders, though researchers and historians have long suspected that the true number of his victims was much higher, perhaps dozens more. Some estimates push the total far beyond that, but the reality is that the occupation gave him a perfect environment in which people could disappear without a complete trace. His trial in 1946 became a national spectacle. France was emerging from war, occupation, collaboration, liberation, and reckoning. Against that backdrop, the Petiot trial felt like a distilled nightmare of the era. Greed feeding on persecution, a doctor turning medicine into murder, and the ordinary trust of desperate people transformed into a death sentence. Petiot, for his part, treated the courtroom like a stage. He was mocking, theatrical, and evasive. He tried to outtalk prosecutors, to charm, to confuse, to provoke. At moments, he seemed less interested in escaping conviction than in proving he could dominate the room one last time. But the evidence was too severe, the pattern too clear, and the horror too public. The court rejected his claims of patriotic necessity and found him guilty. In April 1946, he was sentenced to death. On May 25, 1946, Marcel Petiot was guillotined at La Santé prison in Paris. Even at the end, much remained unresolved. The full identities of all his victims were never established. The full extent of his profits from robbery was never completely recovered. The exact number of those he killed likely died with him. What remains is one of the most chilling stories to come out of occupied Europe, not because it happened in spite of history, but because it happened inside it. Marcel Petiot did not create the desperation of wartime Paris. He exploited it. He understood that in an occupied city people were already accustomed to lies, false names, secret arrangements, and sudden disappearances. He saw that fear had created a market, and he turned that market into murder. His victims had come to him not out of recklessness, but out of terror and hope. They were trying to survive one of the darkest periods in European history. They believed they were paying for a road out of hell. Instead, they found a man who had learned that, under certain conditions, evil does not need to force the door open. It only needs to wait inside, speaking calmly, wearing a doctor's face, and promising safety.